I'm going to talk briefly this afternoon about what we can learn about human relations through the lens of slavery. And I'm going to do that first by talking about what creolization is and means, and how we can understand slavery better through the lens of creolization. So first, let me begin by explaining what creolization is, because when I say it, most people have no idea what I'm talking about. So creolization existed long before the plantation societies that emerged in the Caribbean, and yet they were first acknowledged and recognized as exhibiting creolization. And so what is it, right? If you think about where European modernity was born, which is in the Caribbean islands in the New World, what happened there was that communities with completely unprecedented histories of having any relationship to each other suddenly collided, and often on very violent and incredibly unequal terms, right? But what was interesting about it was the Europeans who came and settled in the Caribbean were often, in fact, trying to flee slave-like conditions themselves, or they were there in hopes of making a profit and a name for themselves. The Africans were there by dint of force, and the Native Americans were facing radical eradication. Right? And yet one of the things that was interesting about their converging was all of them expected to remain exactly as they had been prior to their arrival there. So in other words, the Europeans thought that, sure, they're on this side of the Atlantic, but they'd remain European. The Africans knew that they were in the middle of a disaster, and the Native Americans, while they saw the world as they knew it, homes as they knew it, falling apart and becoming unrecognizable, there was still an expectation that they were themselves. They were Native Americans. And yet if you stop and think about it for a second, right, the Irish in Ireland are very, very different from whites in the US South. Portuguese in Portugal, Angolans in Angola are very different from modern day Brazilians. Right? What explains the difference? Part of the answer is creolization, right? So the first example that's typically used of creolization are the people that started to emerge in the Caribbean who nobody expected to emerge. So for instance, there was, say, a French person who either through rape or through consensual relations suddenly had a child who looked French but also had darker, curlier hair, fuller lips. Or there would be an African person who had a child who had genes that had emerged for colder climates. Right? In other words, people started to emerge who were creolized people, for whom there was no history of people like them having emerged. The family trees of the Europeans who came, the family trees of the Africans who came, suggested that relations and children of this kind were completely unprecedented. Right? They emerged through mixture that wasn't supposed to take place and yet did. The same happened with languages. If you think about the languages that are indigenous to Caribbean societies, the examples people tend to think of are Haitian Creole, Jamaican Patois. Right? And what these languages both show signs of are contributing elements that combine in ways that make them radically distinct. So for instance, for a speaker of languages from the Niger-Congo region, if you hear something like Haitian Creole, there are elements that are certainly recognizable, and yet it's also something radically distinct. Similarly, if you're a French speaker and you hear Haitian Creole, there are elements that are very familiar, and yet it's remade. And so part of what creolization describes is when the legacies of all of the decisions leading up to that point are suddenly radically interrupted, and things continue, whether they're communities or languages, by becoming something radically new, through combining with people and communities that would have seemed completely unprecedented, right? Another very good example of creolization is the diasporic community of Jews. So there are Jewish people in India, there are Jewish people in China, there are Jewish people in Uganda, there are Jewish people in Sao Paulo, right? And in each of these instances, what's very striking is the communities are both very Jewish, immediately recognizable as Jews, and very local. So Jews in China are very Chinese, and Jews in India are very Indian. There are a few exceptions though, right? So for instance, there are communities of European Jews who moved to Mexico and who want very much to remain as they previously were by being pockets of Europe within Mexico. And so what they do is they do everything they can to resist creolization, to remain exactly as they were before. Right? And this actually often happened as well in the Caribbean, where there were Creole elites, so people who were born of mixtures, who were African, European, Native American, but who wanted to set themselves up as a new ideal of mixture that everybody had to try to duplicate. And what they did when they did that was to basically hijack the kind of radical, chaotic, really, version of creolization that was otherwise taking place. Right? But part of what creolization says is that when people move and make new homes for themselves, they do it neither as a bubble nor as a sponge. What do I mean? right? A bubble, while it's very fragile, in the end remains insulated. It doesn't matter where it goes and where it lands. While it's looking out, and you could even look in on it, it remains exactly the same. There are borders around it and enclosing it. And a sponge is the exact opposite. It absorbs everything, right? And creolization suggests that what human beings do when they move into these different contexts is something in between. It's neither or. You become local and you remain distinctive, right? So the other thing that I want to connect creolization to is the very question of the conference, deconstructing humanity, and how it is that we go about doing research and conducting inquiry, since we're in an academic environment and we're at a university, right? And the argument that I would make is that when it comes to a question that's as urgent and big as humanity, right, or deconstructing humanity, when most people approach things in a scholarly way, what they do is they choose their magnifying glass, right? So as an undergrad, you choose your major or your discipline. And so you decide that you'll study sociology, or you'll study psychology, or you'll study biology or literature. Or if you're doing this at the doctoral level, you'll become a biologist, or you'll become a psychologist, or you'll become an economist, right? And for whatever the large problem is, you have your relevant magnifying glass with all of its modes of argumentation, the kinds of skills that are brought with it, et cetera. But often when you're studying these disciplines, people don't remind you or tell you that the way that they developed was actually ex post facto. It developed after the fact, right? So if you look at the early origins of something like sociology or political science, what you have are people trying to figure out problems, whatever it is that interests them most, drawing on whatever resources will prove relevant, right? And it's often after the fact when people look back retrospectively and say, oh, that's sociology, or oh, that's history, right? But what's interesting about it is there's a point at which, to become legitimate, disciplines forget their pasts and make them far purer than they ever were. They make them seem more uniform, more monolithic, and less chaotic than their development in fact suggests, right? And in that moment, what you get is people who will look at something and say, well, that's not history, or that's not biology. There's a kind of policing of what it is that represents a legitimate embodiment of that field, right? And the corresponding part with some of the examples I was giving before would be if somebody were to look at a French child and say, or say a Haitian child, and look at them and say, well, that child's not French. She doesn't look like French in mainland France. Or if somebody were to look at Haitian Creole and say, that's not French. Whereas in fact what they're doing is they're asking the wrong question. Of course that person is not French, and of course that language is not French. But what they're doing in that moment is choosing one contributing strand to something that in fact is a larger syncretic amalgam, and judging it by that standard, rather than treating it as something that's unique and new, right? And so what I would argue about a question like humanity is that it exceeds all of the individual magnifying glasses that any of the disciplines would offer, because it's larger. It represents something vast and comprehensive. And so if we were to study it and make that our priority, rather than being scholars of a particular discipline, so a sociologist, a historian, an economist, what we would get in our approaches to it would be a creolized method. And what I mean by that is, to look at humanity, you need to draw on the vast array of resources from biology, from literature, that will illuminate that question. And so if you're not concerned with being a pure embodiment of your field, the result will be, almost by, naturally, inevitably, a creolized one. So what does this offer a discussion of slavery? This is where I'm going to stop. Most people, when they think about slavery, think about the transatlantic slave trade, right? And what that means is a system, right, the profits of which built the modern world, and where an entire race of people were treated as the natural slave of another race of people who were treated as natural masters, right? And when most people think about slavery, this is what they think of, right? And it makes sense for them to think of this. It was hugely significant to the shape of the world in which we live, and it was the first instance of racialized slavery, right? The difficulty is there was slavery before, and there's slavery after. There's slavery now. And yet, when we try to think of slavery as having to look one way, we miss those examples and all of the lessons that come with it. So for better or for worse, slavery is also a creolized institution. And what that means is it travels, and it looks different depending on where it's made local. Because in each instance, it's an incredibly inhumane way to meet political, social, and economic needs, right? So if you look backwards in time, there was slavery in Europe. The word slave comes from Slav, as for Slavic person. Right? There was slavery in the variety of Muslim empires. There was slavery in Asia. There was slavery in Africa. And today, there's slavery throughout the globe, everywhere except the Arctic, right? And if you look through time as well, the range of people who became slaves and the range of activities done by slaves has also varied. So there were periods in which most slaves were female, or where slavery was primarily urban, or where slaves were actually trained to be the skilled apprentices to artisans, or where slaves commanded armies, right? And yet in all of these instances, these people were in fact slaves in the sense that they were owned by another human being, right? And similarly today, there's slaves who are East Asian, there's slaves who are African, there's slaves who are Eastern European, and they're doing a similar huge range of tasks, from brick making and carpet weaving to selling trinkets and sex and domestic work, right? So where does creolization come in? One of the things that's important about the present is that in slavery being global, there are distinct forms of vulnerability that are converging on a global stage, right? So the kinds of vulnerability that make one very easily enslaved are quite varied. So for instance, there's some places in which coming from a particular ethnic group makes you very vulnerable. There are others where gender is the primary issue. And for some of those people who experience genuine instances of slavery where you look at it and that is what it is, there is the possibility of their being freed and living a free life afterwards. So for instance, with the Eastern European example, in the Eastern European context, gender is predominant. When she moves to Western Europe, her Easternness is predominant. And yet when she comes to this country, she may be poor, but she's a white woman. And so that doesn't necessarily overdetermine a life where the expectation is that she will be servile, right? It's very different when it comes to the situation of Black people. And so even though slavery today is racialized in a very different sense from the transatlantic slave trade, it doesn't matter if you look the world over. People for whom the formal experience of slavery ends, but continue to live with situations of slavery, are almost always, and it's overdetermined, Black people. Right? So let me explain first very quickly what I mean by what it is to live as a slave. And this is why it comes back to the central theme. One of the key features of slave relations is that they're inhuman human relations. You can't have a slave that's not a human being, right? And yet what's key about the situation of a slave, even in more humane circumstances, is that the slave is treated as if he or she has no family with any standing, as if the person has simply appeared sui generis and can be inserted in the community of the master. What that means as well is that the slave, what makes the slave useful is that he or she has human capacities and abilities. And yet again, the point is that the master gets to determine which of those will in fact be useful and which for that reason should be cultivated. So the sense that you have abilities that suggest a trajectory and a life purpose and aspiration, whether that has any standing is entirely determined by the person who's your master. And then lastly, even under very humane conditions, a slave master can decide if you continue to be useful. So you may live as a slave who's highly esteemed, who in fact has great skills, and yet if you cease to be useful to a slave, you can simply, to a master, you can simply be disposed of, right? And if you look at this country, and more generally, but I'll close by looking at this country, if you look at the situation of mass incarceration, if you look at the series of slayings of young Black men by cops, the only way to make sense of these happenings is if we take seriously that these are prime examples of inhuman human relationships, where they're people who, regardless of their merit, characteristics, ability, are treated as if they're simply disposable, because the priorities of whoever it is that's determining their life conditions simply trump who it is, who they are, and what they seek to be. And so the reason, again, that I say creolization is if we're going to be able to understand what's in fact transpiring around us, which is that we are in a period of increased vulnerability, and where some people's vulnerability is very lucrative for others, we have to have a sufficiently malleable lens through which to recognize what's in fact going on around us. And so I was just going to end by my quotation on my name tag is, it's easy to solve a problem that everyone sees, but hard to solve a problem that almost no one sees. And I'm going to be an annoying political scientist and say it's not actually true, right? That it can actually be very hard to solve problems even when everybody sees them. So for instance, most people would agree that our political institutions are broken, and yet we need them more than we probably ever have before. And yet it doesn't make it easy to address it. But part of addressing it is definitely seeing it and seeing it correctly. And I would argue that this concept of creolization that emerges out of all of the travesty that are slave societies will be very useful for doing that. Thank you.